The cold, metallic hull of the Crimson Fang loomed in the vastness of space, its engines barely a whisper in the silence of the cosmos. War Alpha Kreth stood on the bridge, his four insectoid eyes narrowing as they studied the small blue planet on the viewing screen. Earth. His mission was clear: conquer this world as he had done to so many others over the past centuries. The Vraxian Empire had ruled the galaxy for over 10,000 years, conquering species that had dared to resist. And now it was Earth's turn. The planet appeared peaceful, greenlands, blue oceans, and white clouds drifting lazily across the sky. It was a beautiful sight. But beneath that surface, Kreth knew, lay a fragile civilization ripe for the taking. Initial scans complete, his second-in-command, KTH, reported. His mandibles clicked with excitement, though there was a nervous edge in his voice. The dominant species is called humans. They have no natural armor, no claws, no venom. Their bite is weak. Their running speed is average at best. Kreth nodded, feeling a surge of confidence. He had led the conquest of 17 worlds, and this would be no different. The Vraxians were perfect predators. Towering at 8 feet, their exoskeletons were nearly impervious to damage. Their strength and military coordination were unmatched. Humans, from the sound of it, were nothing more than prey. They have nuclear weapons, KTH added, but the delivery systems are slow. No energy weapons, no plasma technology. They barely have faster-than-light travel. Their ships are held together with literal welding. Kreth allowed himself a slight smile. This would be a simple conquest, a career-defining victory to end his service. He could almost taste the glory already. "Send the standard surrender demand," Kreth commanded, his voice a low rumble. "Inform them they will become a tributary world of the Vraxian Empire. They will provide resources and soldiers for our expansion. Resistance will result in complete annihilation." The communications officer worked quickly, sending the transmission across all human frequencies in their primary languages. Kreth had delivered this speech to countless species before, and each one had either surrendered immediately or fought briefly before realizing the futility of resistance. The response from Earth came much quicker than expected. 3 words, simple but carrying a weight that resonated deep into Kreth's mind. "Come and take it." His mandibles twitched in surprise, defiance. It was common enough in the early stages of an invasion, but something about the response felt different. The humans weren't panicking. They weren't cowering in fear. They were challenging him. "Launch the invasion," Kreth ordered, his voice calm but filled with purpose. He had seen many species fall before the might of the Vraxians, and he was certain that these humans would be no different. The Crimson Fang led a battle group of 50 ships toward Earth, dropping pods from orbit to strike 7 different continents simultaneously. The Vraxian military doctrine was simple: strike everywhere at once, overwhelm command structures, and force immediate surrender. Kreth watched as the tactical display on his console began to fill with green markers, indicating the progress of his forces. The first wave of drop pods hit major cities across the planet, and within hours, Vraxians controlled 15 of them. The humans' military bases were scattered and disconnected, offering no organized resistance. Victory, it seemed, was certain. But then something felt wrong. The reports from the ground weren't as expected. The humans were retreating, yes, but they weren't fleeing in disarray. They were falling back in a highly organized manner, taking their weapons and supplies with them, disappearing into their cities and forests. It didn't make sense. Kreth's instinct, honed over 3 centuries of combat, told him that something deeper was at play. The first casualty report came later that evening. A Vraxian patrol in a human city called Baghdad had been ambushed. Improvised explosives had killed 4 of his warriors. The remaining 2 were hunted down by human fighters who seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Kreth studied the report with a growing sense of unease. The humans had struck swiftly with precision. These were not the actions of prey. Prey species either surrendered outright or fought desperate last stands. They did not ambush their conquerors. They did not hunt their hunters. The casualties continued to pile up. A building in Moscow collapsed on a Vraxian squad. Snipers in Atlanta picked off warriors one by one. A fuel depot exploded in Tokyo, killing 20 Vraxians. Each attack was methodical. The humans were not panicking. They were fighting with strategy. "They are cowards," KTH snarled, clearly frustrated. "They hide and strike from shadows. This is not honorable combat." Kreth did not respond immediately. His mind was racing. The humans weren't just fighting back. They were waging a calculated war. A war that Vraxians were not prepared for. He looked at the tactical displays again, analyzing the pattern of the attacks. They were not random. The humans were targeting supply lines, command posts, ammunition depots, everything that would cripple a military force. They were making strategic moves, not out of desperation, but out of deep, calculated strategy. "Increase patrols," Kreth ordered. "Fortify all positions, scan every building before entering. We cannot let them catch us off guard again." But deep down, Kreth couldn't shake the feeling that the humans were not just resisting, they were learning, adapting faster than the Vraxians ever could. That night, as Kreth lay in his quarters, staring out into the vastness of space, he wondered what kind of species he had underestimated. He had never met an enemy like this before. He had been so certain. But now, that certainty was beginning to waver. He had conquered many worlds, but he was beginning to fear that this one might not be so easily taken. Cliffhanger, the next casualty report comes in. It's not just a Vraxian squad, but a full battalion wiped out in an ambush in a city called Chechnya. And this time the humans have captured one of Kreth's warriors. They want him alive. They want to talk. Kreth knows that this will not be like the others. This war is just beginning. The cold, metallic hull of the Crimson Fang loomed in the vastness of space, its engines barely a whisper in the silence of the cosmos. War Alpha Kreth stood on the bridge, his four insectoid eyes narrowing as they studied the small blue planet on the viewing screen. Earth. His mission was clear: conquer this world as he had done to so many others over the past centuries. The Vraxian Empire had ruled the galaxy for over 10,000 years, conquering species that had dared to resist. And now it was Earth's turn. The planet appeared peaceful, greenlands, blue oceans, and white clouds drifting lazily across the sky. It was a beautiful sight. But beneath that surface, Kreth knew, lay a fragile civilization ripe for the taking. "Initial scans complete," his second-in-command, KTH, reported. His mandibles clicked with excitement, though there was a nervous edge in his voice. "The dominant species is called humans. They have no natural armor, no claws, no venom. Their bite is weak. Their running speed is average at best." Kreth nodded, feeling a surge of confidence. He had led the conquest of 17 worlds, and this would be no different. The Vraxians were perfect predators. Towering at 8 feet, their exoskeletons were nearly impervious to damage. Their strength and military coordination were unmatched. Humans, from the sound of it, were nothing more than prey. "They have nuclear weapons," KTH added, "but the delivery systems are slow. No energy weapons, no plasma technology. They barely have faster-than-light travel. Their ships are held together with literal welding." Kreth allowed himself a slight smile. This would be a simple conquest, a career-defining victory to end his service. He could almost taste the glory already. "Send the standard surrender demand," Kreth commanded, his voice a low rumble. "Inform them they will become a tributary world of the Vraxian Empire. They will provide resources and soldiers for our expansion. Resistance will result in complete annihilation." The communications officer worked quickly, sending the transmission across all human frequencies in their primary languages. Kreth had delivered this speech to countless species before, and each one had either surrendered immediately or fought briefly before realizing the futility of resistance. The response from Earth came much quicker than expected. 3 words, simple but carrying a weight that resonated deep into Kreth's mind. "Come and take it." His mandibles twitched in surprise, defiance. It was common enough in the early stages of an invasion, but something about the response felt different. The humans weren't panicking. They weren't cowering in fear. They were challenging him. "Launch the invasion," Kreth ordered, his voice calm but filled with purpose. He had seen many species fall before the might of the Vraxians, and he was certain that these humans would be no different. The Crimson Fang led a battle group of 50 ships toward Earth, dropping pods from orbit to strike 7 different continents simultaneously. The Vraxian military doctrine was simple: strike everywhere at once, overwhelm command structures, and force immediate surrender. Kreth watched as the tactical display on his console began to fill with green markers, indicating the progress of his forces. The first wave of drop pods hit major cities across the planet, and within hours, Vraxians controlled 15 of them. The humans' military bases were scattered and disconnected, offering no organized resistance. Victory, it seemed, was certain. But then something felt wrong. The reports from the ground weren't as expected. The humans were retreating, yes, but they weren't fleeing in disarray. They were falling back in a highly organized manner, taking their weapons and supplies with them, disappearing into their cities and forests. It didn't make sense. Kreth's instinct, honed over 3 centuries of combat, told him that something deeper was at play. The first casualty report came later that evening. A Vraxian patrol in a human city called Baghdad had been ambushed. Improvised explosives had killed 4 of his warriors. The remaining 2 were hunted down by human fighters who seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Kreth studied the report with a growing sense of unease. The humans had struck swiftly with precision. These were not the actions of prey. Prey species either surrendered outright or fought desperate last stands. They did not ambush their conquerors. They did not hunt their hunters. The casualties continued to pile up. A building in Moscow collapsed on a Vraxian squad. Snipers in Atlanta picked off warriors one by one. A fuel depot exploded in Tokyo, killing 20 Vraxians. Each attack was methodical. The humans were not panicking. They were fighting with strategy. "They are cowards," KTH snarled, clearly frustrated. "They hide and strike from shadows. This is not honorable combat." Kreth did not respond immediately. His mind was racing. The humans weren't just fighting back. They were waging a calculated war, a war that Vraxians were not prepared for. He looked at the tactical displays again, analyzing the pattern of the attacks. They were not random. The humans were targeting supply lines, command posts, ammunition depots, everything that would cripple a military force. They were making strategic moves, not out of desperation, but out of deep, calculated strategy. "Increase patrols," Kreth ordered. "Fortify all positions, scan every building before entering. We cannot let them catch us off guard again." But deep down, Kreth couldn't shake the feeling that the humans were not just resisting. They were learning, adapting faster than the Vraxians ever could. That night, as Kreth lay in his quarters, staring out into the vastness of space, he wondered what kind of species he had underestimated. He had never met an enemy like this before. He had been so certain. But now, that certainty was beginning to waver. He had conquered many worlds, but he was beginning to fear that this one might not be so easily taken. The next casualty report comes in. It's not just a Vraxian squad, but a full battalion wiped out in an ambush in a city called Chechnya. And this time, the humans have captured one of Kreth's warriors. They want him alive. They want to talk. Kreth knows that this will not be like the others. This war is just beginning. The war had not been expected to drag on. Kreth had anticipated the usual swift collapse of resistance. But the more time he spent on Earth, the more he realized that humanity was unlike any species he had encountered before. Every victory felt hollow. Every step forward was met with unexpected setbacks. The humans adapted far quicker than he had ever imagined. The invasion of Earth had been a brutal one, but Kreth and his forces had succeeded in capturing the major cities. However, the more they advanced, the more they found themselves at odds with humanity's resistance. It wasn't just that the humans were hiding. No, they were everywhere. They fought in every corner, from the vast urban sprawls to the deepest forests, and their weapons, though primitive, had been effective. The humans had an ingenuity that was becoming a serious concern. On Earth's surface, Kreth's forces continued to fortify their positions. Cities fell one by one, but they weren't easy victories. Every time the Vraxians took a strategic position, they found themselves paying for it. A small human insurgent force in Sao Paulo destroyed a communications array. A bombing in Rio de Janeiro wiped out a Vraxian supply convoy. Even worse, these humans didn't just hide in the shadows. They hit hard and then vanished. In one operation, a Vraxian squad was sent to clear out an underground resistance cell in a city called Paris. They entered an old subway station, expecting to find only a handful of humans hiding, but instead, they found a well-organized network of tunnels and makeshift armaments. The soldiers barely escaped, but not without losing a third of their number. The humans had built an intricate underground network to resist the invaders, which Kreth had not anticipated. And that wasn't all. The human guerrilla tactics continued to evolve. Improvised explosive devices, IEDs, became a frequent nightmare for Kreth's forces. They were everywhere, attached to doors, placed in the road, hidden under rocks. Every step was a calculated risk. The humans weren't just passive victims. They had become active participants in the war, learning quickly from their mistakes and adapting to the Vraxian way of warfare. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon of Earth's western hemisphere, Kreth sat in his command center, reviewing the latest casualty reports. There was a growing sense of dread in the air. The deaths were mounting. His warriors had been dying at a rate Kreth had never experienced before. "War Alpha," KTH's voice crackled through the comm. We have news from Earth's northern continent, Canada. A Vraxian squad was ambushed by a group of humans using Vraxian armor and weapons. The entire squad was lost. Kreth felt the blood drain from his face. Vraxian technology, once their greatest advantage, was being used against them. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. The humans had learned from their mistakes. They had figured out how to adapt to their invaders. No longer just hiding and fighting from the shadows, they were becoming skilled at using the Vraxians' own weapons and armor. His mind raced. The humans were no longer just prey. They were evolving, fighting like the Vraxians, but with an unpredictability that was making it difficult for his forces to counter. Each day, it seemed, they became more dangerous, and the Vraxians, despite their might, were still struggling to keep up. Later that night, as the reports flooded in, Kreth sat alone in his quarters, reflecting on everything that had transpired. The humans had been fighting for survival for centuries, and now they were showing just how far they would go. They weren't afraid to die, and worse still, they weren't afraid to win. The following morning, Kreth made a decision. He had learned from his encounter with Sarah Chen, the human scientist who had been captured and later released. She had told him something he couldn't forget. "You have never met a species like us," she had said, her eyes burning with determination. "We are not special. We are something worse. We are what happens when prey becomes predator." Her words rang in his ears, something worse, something that wasn't driven by strength alone, something that used its mind, its ingenuity as its greatest weapon. The humans had fought predators for millennia, and now they had become one of them. But they were a different kind of predator. They didn't hunt for dominance. They hunted for survival. They would do whatever it took to keep from being wiped out. Kreth had spent centuries leading conquests for the Vraxian Empire. He had seen entire worlds fall before him, but Earth was different. The humans weren't just surviving. They were thriving in ways the Vraxians had never expected, and that was terrifying. He had underestimated them, and now Earth was becoming a quagmire. As the days passed, Kreth's frustration grew. The Vraxians had the upper hand in terms of firepower and numbers, but the humans had something that could not be measured by sheer strength alone. They had the will to survive, and they had learned how to make that will into a weapon. Then, in the heart of the war, as Kreth's forces continued to struggle, the humans launched a surprise strike. An entire Vraxian supply depot outside the city of Delhi was destroyed. The attackers used Vraxian weapons and armor, leaving no trace of the humans who had carried out the operation. The strike was a devastating blow to Kreth's forces, and it marked a turning point in the conflict. The humans were adapting faster than the Vraxians ever could, and that scared Kreth more than any enemy he had ever faced. Kreth's intelligence reports continue to pour in, each one more troubling than the last. The humans are not only becoming experts in Vraxian tactics, they are beginning to infiltrate key areas of the Vraxian military itself. Kreth orders a full investigation, but as the operation begins, a chilling discovery is made. The humans have managed to decrypt Vraxian communications. They know everything, and they're getting smarter by the day. The war had reached a point of no return. Every day, the Vraxian forces bled a little more, their casualties mounting, their morale sinking. Kreth's once unshakable confidence was beginning to crack. The humans were not just a threat. They were a living nightmare, constantly shifting, constantly adapting, and fighting with a desperation that matched the Vraxian will to conquer. The Vraxian Empire had been built on one core principle: the survival of the fittest. For centuries, the Vraxians had been the apex predators of the galaxy, hunting, conquering, and destroying worlds. And now, for the first time in 10 millennia, the Vraxian Empire was up against a species that not only refused to be prey, but was turning the hunt back on its predator. Kreth had witnessed many species fall before the might of the Vraxians. But humans, they fought with a different kind of intensity, one that made every Vraxian victory seem hollow. Humans were not strong by nature. Their bodies were weak, their technology was rudimentary compared to the Vraxians, and their ships were little more than welded-together scraps of metal. Yet in their weakness, they had become stronger than any species the Vraxians had ever faced. It was a puzzle that kept Kreth awake at night. And in the quiet of his command center, he found himself staring at a new intelligence report, one that shook him to his core. The humans had begun to reverse-engineer Vraxian technology. They had captured several of his warriors, and in doing so, they had learned enough to use Vraxian plasma rifles, a weapon once thought to be exclusive to his species. The implications were staggering. If the humans could master Vraxian weapons, They would no longer be dependent on their primitive firearms or homemade explosives. They would fight back with the same ferocity, the same level of technological superiority that the Vraxians themselves used. Kreth wasn't sure if he should feel anger or respect. He had never encountered a species that learned so quickly. But he also couldn't ignore the growing realization that the humans weren't simply adapting, they were evolving. Sarah Chen, the human scientist-turned-resistance leader, had been captured weeks earlier during a raid on one of the Vraxian military bases. Kreth had hoped to use her as leverage, but what she had given him instead was knowledge. Not just military knowledge, but an insight into what made humans tick. She had broken down her species' history, centuries of war, strife, and survival. It wasn't their strength that allowed them to thrive, but their willingness to do whatever it took to survive. The human mind, she had said in one of their rare conversations, is our greatest weapon. It allows us to adapt, to think outside of the box. While the Vraxians rely on brute force and tradition, we rely on innovation. We learn, we change, and when you least expect it, we'll strike. Kreth had found her words haunting, but he couldn't deny their truth. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. The Vraxians were specialists. They were born to fight, born to conquer. But humans were generalists. They could adapt to any situation, turn any weakness into a strength. They had been fighting wars for millennia, constantly refining their tactics, constantly evolving. It was no wonder that the humans had become so difficult to defeat. The Vraxian Empire had been built on fear. Fear of the Vraxians' strength, fear of their overwhelming power. But the humans had no fear, and in the absence of fear, they had learned to fight back in ways no one could predict. Kreth paced back and forth in his command center. His warriors were becoming more and more frustrated, their morale plummeting. Some began to question their mission, while others, particularly the younger Vraxians, began to doubt their superiority. The humans weren't just defending their world, they were showing the galaxy that even the mightiest predator could be wounded. Meanwhile, Sarah Chen, though imprisoned, had become a symbol of resistance. Her influence among the human rebels had only grown since her capture. Kreth, ever calculating, had allowed her some liberties, books, limited communication with her fellow humans, hopping to extract more information from her. But it was becoming clear. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was a strategist, a leader, and someone who understood the deeper complexities of warfare better than anyone Kreth had encountered. One evening, as Kreth sat at his desk reviewing the latest reports, he received an encrypted message. It was from Sarah Chen. "You've underestimated us. We have more allies than you realize. Our fight is not just about surviving, it's about taking our future back. And we will fight until the last of us falls." Kreth's mandibles twitched as he read the message. He had been underestimating the humans all along. But now, the full scope of the situation began to settle in. This wasn't just a war for Earth. This was a war that could shape the future of the galaxy. The humans weren't just defending their world. They were making a statement. They were telling the galaxy that no empire, no matter how mighty, could stand forever if its prey refused to behave like prey. The Vraxians had built their empire on fear, but the humans were showing them that fear had limits. Kreth clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had no choice but to adapt. The Vraxians had always relied on their brute strength, but that was no longer enough. He had to evolve. The next day, Kreth called for a strategy meeting. He knew his forces were exhausted. The humans were spreading across the planet, striking with renewed vigor, and the Vraxian command was becoming increasingly chaotic. It was time to change tactics. As he addressed his generals, he made a decision. The Vraxian forces would regroup and fortify their positions in key locations, but they would also begin to shift their focus. No longer would they rely solely on direct assault and destruction. They would need to infiltrate the human ranks, learn their strategies, and fight fire with fire. "Humanity has shown us that they are more than just prey," Kreth said to his generals. "They are a species of predators, and we must fight them as such. We adapt or we perish." The Vraxians begin their new strategy of infiltration. They attempt to blend in, using captured human technology and tactics. But as the first Vraxian spies are deployed in major human cities, they make a chilling discovery. The humans have already anticipated their move. They were waiting for them. The atmosphere on Earth had changed. No longer was the world filled with the frenzy of Vraxian conquest and human desperation. Now, it was a simmering battlefield of strategic moves, ambushes, and calculated risks. The Vraxians had learned to adapt, but the humans had already anticipated their every move. What was once an invincible war machine now felt sluggish and uncertain, like a predator that had encountered its first true rival. Kreth sat in his command center, staring at the tactical displays. His forces were spread thin. The cities they held were becoming harder to maintain. The humans were always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike. And it wasn't just the cities. They had begun to target the very essence of Vraxian warfare, their supply lines. The latest intelligence report had come in with grim news. A Vraxian convoy carrying food and ammunition had been attacked in the heart of Africa. The humans had used modified civilian vehicles as weapons, ramming them into Vraxian transport ships and detonating the cargo. The attack had crippled the convoy and sent shockwaves through Vraxian command. "They're learning," KTH muttered, watching the report unfold. "They've turned our own tactics against us." "They're not just learning," Kreth replied, his mandibles clicking in frustration. "They're evolving faster than we are." For every victory the Vraxians won, the humans made them pay. It was no longer about territory or resources. It was a war of attrition. The humans didn't need to win every battle. They just needed to make every victory feel like a loss. The Vraxians had begun to understand this painful truth. The humans were not afraid to die. Kreth had read their history, the countless wars they'd fought, each one leaving scars on their civilization. They didn't fight for glory or dominance. They fought for survival, and that survival came at any cost. It was a mentality that Kreth's species could never truly grasp. The Vraxians fought to win, but the humans, they fought to live, and if that meant sacrificing everything, so be it. The more Kreth reflected on this, the more he realized how deeply the humans had changed the nature of this war. They had no plans for surrender. No amount of force could break their spirit. They adapted just like the Vraxians, but unlike the Vraxians, they adapted in ways that made them more dangerous by the day. That morning, another report came in. The Vraxians had lost control of an entire continent. It had started as a small, isolated resistance in the mountains of Tibet, but now it had spread like wildfire. The humans had coordinated with other resistance cells, using guerrilla tactics, sabotage, and even their own captured Vraxian technology. The cities the Vraxians had conquered were slipping through their fingers. One by one, key strongholds fell. Kreth ordered a full review of the situation. His forces were losing more ground than they were gaining. His warriors were growing weary, the deaths mounting, and the supply chains being constantly interrupted. The situation had become untenable. "We need reinforcements," KTH insisted. "Without them, we cannot hold on much longer." Kreth had sent several requests to the High Command over the past few weeks. The responses were always the same. Victory is mandatory, failure is not acceptable. But failure was creeping closer with every passing day. In the midst of this, Kreth's mind wandered back to Sarah Chen, the human resistance leader. She had been captured months ago and had spent most of her time in a secure cell. During their brief conversations, Kreth had begun to see something in her that he hadn't seen in any of the other prisoners he had interrogated. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't afraid of anything. The humans had fought their own kind in wars that spanned centuries. Wars that had seen the death of millions, that had torn entire nations apart. Yet somehow they had survived. And now they were fighting to protect a planet they had barely begun to understand. Her words haunted Kreth still. "You have never met a species like us. We do not fear death. We only fear losing the chance to fight." He had seen that same spirit in the humans who fought. They didn't stop when they were wounded. They didn't stop when they lost their families. They kept fighting because that was all they knew how to do. One evening, Kreth requested an audience with Sarah Chen. He had learned much from his studies of human history, but there was something he still didn't understand. Something that seemed to set humans apart from every other species. When she entered his quarters, he noticed her defiance was gone, replaced by a calm, almost serene resolve. She had been through countless interrogations, and yet she seemed untouched by them. She was a warrior in her own way, not with weapons, but with words. "Why do you fight?" Kreth asked bluntly. "What is it that keeps you going despite everything, despite the casualties, the destruction?" Sarah looked at him, her expression hard but filled with an unmistakable glimmer of something deeper. "We fight because we have no other choice. We fight because we can." Her response was simple, but it struck him like a blade. The Vraxians had always fought because they had to conquer. The humans fought because they had to survive. "We do not conquer," she continued. "We endure, And when we endure, we grow stronger. You might have your power, Kreth, but we have something you will never understand. We have the will to never stop. Kreth remained silent. He had thought that by understanding the human mindset, he could break it. But instead, it was he who had been changed. His species fought for dominance, for control. The humans, they fought to live. Days turned into weeks, and the situation on Earth grew worse for the Vraxians. Despite their overwhelming firepower, they couldn't keep up with the guerrilla tactics employed by the humans. They had no central leadership, no unified army, just scattered cells of resistance fighters working together in ways the Vraxians could not anticipate. The Vraxians held cities during the day, but by night the humans owned the shadows. Sabotage became a constant threat. Vraxian commanders were targeted in their sleep, killed by assassins who moved like ghosts through the night. Supplies were poisoned. Military convoys were ambushed. The humans had found the one weakness the Vraxians could never account for, the human ability to adapt, to survive against insurmountable odds. As the pressure mounts, Kreth receives a final, desperate message from the High Command. The Vraxians are ordered to use whatever means necessary to break the humans' will. A new weapon is being prepared, the Empire's final solution to the problem of Earth. But as Kreth contemplates this final option, he knows that using it will change everything, not just for Earth, but for the Vraxians as well. The next step will decide the future of both species. The war had reached a tipping point. After months of brutal combat, the Vraxian Empire found itself at a crossroads. Every victory they claimed came at a significant cost, while human resistance grew stronger, more coordinated, and more unpredictable. For the first time in the history of the Vraxian Empire, it seemed like victory was slipping further out of their grasp. Kreth stood in his command center, his eyes fixed on the holographic display of Earth. The planet was covered in red markers, signifying areas of Vraxian control, but they were shrinking. The human resistance was everywhere, like an unstoppable force. He had sent reinforcements, but it had made little difference. The Vraxians were fighting for every inch, and every battle felt like a Pyrrhic victory. His warriors were exhausted. Their morale was shattered. The human attacks had become more sophisticated. They had learned to adapt to every tactic the Vraxians used, and with every failed mission, the Vraxians began to doubt their superiority. "We can't keep this up much longer," KTH said, his voice tinged with frustration. "We've lost 40% of our fleet. The humans don't stop. Every time we take a city, they take it back." Kreth felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The High Command had ordered the Vraxian forces to continue the war at any cost, but Kreth could feel the strain. The Empire had never faced an enemy like this. They had never fought a species that refused to break. For a brief moment, Kreth wondered if this was the beginning of the end for the Vraxian Empire. They had conquered worlds without resistance for millennia, but now they were being torn apart by a species that had no intention of giving up. "We need to end this," Kreth muttered to himself, his mind racing. He had seen the casualty reports, the shattered morale, the growing dissent within his own ranks. He couldn't afford to let this drag on any longer. If the humans kept fighting this way, they would bleed the Vraxian Empire dry. But how? That evening, as he sat alone in his quarters, his thoughts were interrupted by a sudden transmission. It was from the High Command. The message was brief but clear. Victory is mandatory. Failure is not acceptable. The pressure was mounting. The Vraxians had no choice but to win. And then, as if fate had decided to throw one last blow, the unthinkable happened. Kreth received a report that made his blood run cold. The humans had launched a successful strike against a Vraxian supply depot located in the heart of India. It wasn't just the loss of supplies that was devastating. It was the method they had used to execute the strike. The humans had infiltrated the depot. They had used Vraxian technology, plasma rifles, stolen armor, and attacked their own supply lines. What made this attack different was that it wasn't a guerrilla strike. The humans had coordinated the attack with military precision, using their own forces, their own stolen Vraxian equipment. Kreth felt something he hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. The Vraxians had always relied on their superior technology, strength, and coordination. But the humans had turned it against them. They had studied their enemies, learned from their mistakes, and adapted in ways that made the Vraxians look like amateurs. This was no longer just a war of attrition. This was a battle for survival for both species. The days that followed were filled with mounting desperation. The Vraxian Empire had thrown everything it had into Earth, But no matter how many cities they captured, the humans continued to fight back. The constant sabotage, the ambushes, the hit-and-run tactics, they were wearing the Vraxians down. And now, with every loss, the Vraxians were losing more than just soldiers. They were losing their grip on their empire. One day, Kreth received a disturbing report from his command staff. A small group of humans, operating behind Vraxian lines, had sabotaged one of their key weapons systems. It was the beginning of a trend. The humans were no longer just fighting with primitive weapons. They were starting to use Vraxian technology against the Vraxians themselves. "They've infiltrated our ranks," KTH said, his voice grim. "We've been compromised, the humans are everywhere." Kreth's mandibles twitched. How had they gotten so far ahead? He had never considered that the humans would adapt so quickly. The Vraxians had always been the apex predators, and now, for the first time, they were the prey. As the casualties mounted and reinforcements continued to fail to arrive, Kreth made a decision. It was time to act. The Vraxians were going to deploy their ultimate weapon, a biological agent that could wipe out the human population without destroying the planet. It was a last resort, one that Kreth had hoped to avoid, but the situation had become dire. The humans had proven to be resilient, too resilient. The Vraxian Empire had no choice but to eradicate them completely. The weapon was designed to target the human immune system, making them sick without harming the environment. It was a calculated strike, a way to neutralize the human threat without causing irreversible damage to the planet. The Vraxians would wipe out humanity's ability to fight, rendering them defenseless. But as Kreth reviewed the data, something stopped him. He thought back to Sarah Chen, the human resistance leader who had been captured. She had taught him something he couldn't ignore. The humans didn't fight for power, for land, or for dominance. They fought for survival. And they were willing to die for it. Kreth's mind raced. The weapon could end the war, but it could also break something far more important, the spirit of humanity. Would it be worth it? Could the Vraxians really win if they destroyed everything humanity stood for? He had seen what the humans were capable of. They had endured for centuries. They had fought wars that had torn their species apart, yet they still survived. Could the Vraxians truly wipe them out? It was a difficult choice. The biological weapon would destroy humanity's ability to resist, but it would also destroy the one thing that had made them so powerful, their will to survive. As Kreth stands on the precipice of a decision that will change the course of the war, he receives an unexpected message from Sarah Chen. She demands a meeting, an ultimatum. If Kreth doesn't agree to talk, humanity will unleash a devastating retaliation that could tear the Vraxian Empire apart. For the first time, Kreth feels a flicker of hope and fear. The fate of both species now hangs in the balance. The war had taken everything from the Vraxians, more than they could ever have imagined. And now, at the very edge of their empire's future, Kreth found himself at a crossroads. The human resistance had become something more than just an enemy to fight. It had become a symbol of defiance, a testament to survival, and for the first time in his long career, Kreth questioned everything he had ever known about warfare, about conquest, and about his own species. The biological weapon was ready. A fleet of Vraxian ships stood by, poised to release the agent that would eradicate humanity's ability to resist. It would be a swift, clean end. But something inside Kreth hesitated. He had seen the humanity in Sarah Chen's eyes when they spoke in her prison cell. She wasn't afraid. She was a strategist, a leader, and she had shown him a different way to think about this war. Then, as if fate itself had decided to change the course of this conflict, Kreth received a transmission that would forever alter the trajectory of the Vraxian Empire. It was from Sarah Chen. Kreth, her voice came through the secure channel, calm but unmistakably firm. "I demand to meet with you, now." Kreth stood motionless for a long moment. The tension in the air felt thick, almost tangible. He had expected many things from the humans, resistance, sabotage, even betrayal, but never this. An ultimatum. The very idea that Sarah Chen, a human leader, could so boldly demand to speak with him was a sign of the changing tides. The humans had always been unpredictable, but now they were pushing for something more. "The humans are tired of fighting," KTH muttered from behind him as if sensing Kreth's unease. "We've forced them to the brink. They're going to try to negotiate for peace. We must crush them now before they recover." Kreth turned to face his second-in-command. The words rang true, but something deep inside him said there was more to this than just an end to the fighting. Sarah Chen was not offering surrender. She was offering a chance for something else, something that might save both their species from complete destruction. That evening, Kreth arranged for the meeting. He knew this was a dangerous gamble. The Vraxian Empire had never before negotiated with a species they had been at war with. It was unheard of, and many of his generals would not approve. But there was something about this human woman, something about her conviction, that drew him in. When Sarah Chen entered the meeting room, she did so with an air of quiet authority. There was no fear in her eyes, only the same calm, steely resolve that had defined her throughout the war. Her demeanor was unchanged from their earlier encounters, calm, composed, but with an underlying intensity that Kreth could not ignore. "War Alpha Kreth," she said, her voice steady, but her words carrying the weight of years of struggle. "I'm here to offer you an alternative to the annihilation of my people." Kreth's mandibles twitched. He had expected defiance, perhaps even more threats. But this was different. He had to admit that this human who had once been a prisoner was now speaking with the authority of a leader who had earned her place among the stars. "An alternative?" Kreth's voice was a low rumble, though he carefully masked the curiosity he felt. "You have no choice but to surrender, human. Your species is outmatched. The biological weapon is ready to be deployed. Your resistance is futile." Sarah's gaze did not waver. "You don't understand, do you? You think this is about winning or losing a war, but you're missing the point. We don't fight for glory, we fight for survival. And in that we have an advantage you can't match." Kreth's mind raced. The humans had fought for their survival since the dawn of their species. Their wars, their atrocities, their advancements, they were all driven by a singular purpose: to continue. And in their relentless pursuit of life, they had learned to adapt, to innovate, and to never stop fighting, even when it seemed impossible. "I'm here to offer you something that can end this war, Kreth," Sarah continued, her eyes locking onto his. "You don't need to destroy us. What we need is simple: a ceasefire, negotiations, and a recognition of Earth as a sovereign world. No more conquest, no more domination. Let us decide our own fate. In return, we'll help you rebuild what you've lost." Kreth felt a surge of emotion: anger, confusion, frustration. The Vraxian Empire had never been forced to negotiate. It had always conquered, always demanded. But Sarah Chen was offering a way out, one that didn't involve total destruction, one that didn't force the Vraxians to lose everything they had built over 10,000 years. "You've gone mad," Kreth growled. "You are losing this war, your people are dying, you cannot win. Why would you ask for peace now?" Sarah's expression softened, but her words were firm. "We don't need to win, Kreth. We just need to make you see that this war has no end. If you continue, you will destroy both our species. We have already lost enough. What we're offering is a way forward, a way to stop this madness before it consumes us both." Kreth's mind was swirling. For the first time in his life, he was questioning his orders, questioning everything he had ever believed about strength, domination, and conquest. The humans had offered something he had never considered: peace, not through victory, but through survival. As Sarah spoke, Kreth looked out at the shattered cityscape visible through the window. The Vraxian Empire, the once unchallenged force of the galaxy, had been worn down by a species with no natural advantages, but with an uncanny ability to adapt. He had underestimated them, and now they were offering a chance to end the war, not with weapons, but with a treaty. As Kreth deliberates, the Vraxian High Command contacts him, demanding immediate action. The biological weapon is ready to be deployed. The order is clear: end humanity. No peace talks. The stakes are raised. Kreth must choose between obeying his orders and listening to the one human who has shown him a different path. Time is running out. The room was silent as Kreth stared at the transmission from the Vraxian High Command. The message was as cold and impersonal as the galaxy itself. Deploy the biological weapon immediately. No further delays. Humanity's resistance must be eradicated to ensure Vraxian supremacy. Sarah Chen's calm, determined gaze never left him. She had offered peace, but peace was now a distant possibility, overshadowed by the weight of his orders. The Vraxian Empire, with its millennia of conquest and dominance, demanded that Kreth fulfill his mission, regardless of the cost. And yet in his mind a battle raged, a war not of weapons, but of ideology. The Vraxian Empire had always been built on strength, dominance, and the ability to crush anything that dared resist. This was the way of his people, and yet there was something in Sarah's words that unsettled him. The war would consume both species. She was right. The humans, with their unrelenting will to survive, had adapted in ways that Kreth had never anticipated, and now they had offered a path forward. But that path was not the one his empire had prepared for. He had been trained to lead with force, to conquer, to control. Could he really break that tradition? Could he really turn away from the weapon that would guarantee victory? As the seconds stretched into minutes, Kreth felt something stir deep within him. It was fear, not for his own life, but for the future. What if he followed through with the weapon? What would the galaxy look like then? The Vraxians would have won, but they would have destroyed a species that had, in a way, shown them a better way to survive. And what would that victory be worth? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sound, a beep from the command console. The High Command was reaching out again. Their urgency was unmistakable. The weapon was ready, and they were not waiting any longer. Kreth turned to Sarah, his mandibles clicking in frustration. "You must understand, this war cannot continue. The Empire—" He stopped himself, realizing he was about to speak in a way he had never allowed himself before. The Vraxian Empire had never been questioned, never been forced to look inward, but now it was all he could think about. "The Vraxian Empire wants victory at any cost. I don't know if I can stop them." Sarah's voice was steady but full of quiet determination. "You can stop them, Kreth. You've already shown that you can adapt. You've already learned more about us than any of your generals have. You've seen how we fight. You've seen that we can't be destroyed. But you also know we don't want to destroy you." Her words lingered in the air, and for the first time, Kreth felt the weight of the decision before him. The biological weapon could end humanity's resistance, but it would also destroy everything he had learned. It would erase the very essence of what made humanity unique. The Vraxians had relied on force to control. Could he really allow that to happen to a species that had shown him a different way? He turned away from the console and walked to the window, his 4 eyes watching the devastation below. Earth had become a battleground, but even in the chaos, there was something beautiful about the humans' ability to adapt, to survive, to fight, not just with weapons, but with ingenuity. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quiet, "but I can't do it. I won't be the one to destroy your people, not after everything I've seen." Sarah's face softened, though her eyes remained focused. "Then we'll find another way. But we need your help, Kreth. We need you to make the Vraxians see that we can coexist, not as conquerors and conquered, but as equals." Kreth turned back to face her, his decision made. "I will do what I can, but I cannot guarantee the Empire will listen." The negotiations begin. Kreth sent a message to the High Command, something that had never been said in the history of the Vraxian Empire. His words were carefully chosen, each one laden with the weight of the decision he had just made. "The weapon will not be deployed. I will seek a ceasefire and arrange negotiations. The humans are not our enemy, they are our equals." The response from the High Command was swift, furious, but Kreth stood firm. For the first time, he was not the warrior leading a conquest. He was a leader making a choice that could change the course of galactic history. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. The Vraxian Empire had never been known for diplomacy, and even if a ceasefire were reached, it would not be a simple victory. But he had seen something in the humans, something that made him believe that peace was not just possible, but necessary. Days later, the Vraxian and human negotiators stood in a neutral conference room aboard an orbital station, high above Earth. Kreth arrived with his entourage, while Sarah Chen and her team of diplomats arrived on the other side of the room. The atmosphere was tense, but there was a sense of hope in the air, something that had never been present in the galaxy when the Vraxians had conquered. The first words spoken were from Kreth, his voice loud and clear. "We do not seek to destroy you, humanity. We only wish for an end to this conflict. You have proven your strength, your resolve. It is time for us to find a path forward, one of cooperation, not conquest." Sarah Chen stood, her expression resolute. "We agree, but this peace must be built on mutual respect. The humans will not be subjugated, nor will we be forced to live under your rule. We will stand as equals or not at all." The treaty. The days that followed were filled with heated debates, concessions, and compromises. The Vraxians and humans haggled over the terms of the ceasefire. The Vraxians would withdraw from Earth, recognize its sovereignty, and offer reparations for the destruction caused. In return, humanity would agree to open trade relations, share their scientific discoveries, and agree to a non-aggression pact. It was not perfect. There were still hard feelings, old grudges that would take time to heal. But it was a start. It was a future where both species could coexist rather than destroy each other. The treaty was signed in a ceremony that none of the attendees would ever forget. Kreth, Once the ruthless War Alpha of the Vraxian Empire, now stood as a symbol of change. And Sarah Chen, once a prisoner, now stood as humanity's representative, guiding them into a new era. Years passed and the galaxy began to change. The Vraxians, once a symbol of fear and domination, began to rebuild their empire, not through conquest, but through trade, diplomacy, and mutual cooperation. They had learned from humanity's example that strength alone was not enough. Adaptability, innovation, and cooperation were the true keys to survival. Kreth, now the Vraxian ambassador to Earth, often stood alongside Sarah Chen as they discussed the future. Together, they worked to ensure that the peace they had fought for would last, and that their two species could work together, rather than against each other. One day, as they looked out over the bustling streets of New York, Kreth turned to Sarah. "I never thought it would come to this," he said, his voice thoughtful. Sarah smiled, her eyes filled with understanding. "None of us did, but we got here because we kept fighting, and now we get to build something better." "Maybe," Kreth mused, "we're not so different after all." "No," Sarah agreed, "we're not." As the two watched the sun set over a city that had once been torn apart by war, they knew that the future, though uncertain, was now in their hands. A future of peace, cooperation, and a shared understanding that had once seemed impossible. The war had changed the galaxy. The Vraxian Empire was no longer a symbol of fear, but a testament to the power of adaptation. And humanity, once thought to be weak, had become a beacon of hope, showing the galaxy that survival was not about being the strongest, but about learning, evolving, and forging alliances with those once considered enemies. And so, as the stars stretched out before them, Kreth and Sarah Chen knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning.